Hey gang, Dr. D here. How you doing? I'm going to go over the short version of the cardiac cycle so that you can hear it. And you'll want to compare this to the Wiggers diagram for your cardiac cycle drop box. Ready? Okay. So in the SA node, during ventricular filling, the SA node generates an action potential because the IF channels have had an influx of sodium to depolarize the membrane to reach threshold of voltage-gated calcium channels and to generate an action potential. The action potential then spreads through the internodal pathways throughout the entire atria into the cardiac contractile cells. As this wave of depolarization occurs, we see a change in the ECG seen as a P wave. This causes the cardiac contractile cells to contract, which raises the pressure of the atria. The increase in pressure of the atria forces just a little bit more blood into the ventricles because the pressure in the atria is greater than the pressure in the ventricle, which it was during ventricular filling, but now we added a little extra pressure. While the atria are contracting, the electrical conduction system makes its way to the AV node and into the AV bundle. And there, because there aren't as many gap junctions, the wave of depolarization doesn't go through quite as quickly. It's delayed, in fact, giving time for the atria to complete and top off ventricular filling. But eventually the electrical conduction does make its way to the ventricular side, where it is very quickly propagated through the left and right bundle branches to the apex of the heart, and then around to both ventricles via the Purkinje fibers, delivering the action potentials to all of the cardiac contractile cells of the ventricle, which now begin to initiate a wave of depolarization throughout the entire ventricle, seen on the ECG as the QRS complex. The QRS complex represents that ventricular depolarization, which causes the ventricles to contract. This occurs at the same time that the atria repolarize, and as the atria repolarize, the ventricles depolarize, the atrial pressure drops while the ventricular pressure becomes greater. This causes the pressure in the ventricle to very quickly exceed the pressure in the atria, which causes the atrioventricular valves to snap close. First heart sound. The amount of fluid that has made its way into the heart is referred to as the end diastolic volume. And at this point, the pressure in the ventricle begins to rise during a period known as isovolumetric contraction. This is so because the pressure in the ventricle is greater in the atria, but not greater than the pressure in the conducting arteries. So all of the valves are closed during this time. However, the ventricles are contracting and contracting during a ventricular systole. So consequently, the ventricles, the ventricular pressure rises and rises and rises until the ventricular pressure at the end of this isovolumetric contraction becomes greater than the pressure in the conducting arteries. This causes the semilunar valves to open, and therefore blood is ejected from the ventricles into the conducting arteries. On the right side, the pulmonary artery, on the left side, the aorta. The amount of blood that's ejected during this period of time is known as the stroke volume amount of blood. Eventually, however, just like we saw in the atria, the ventricles also begin to repolarize. This is seen on the ECG. Atrial repolarization is not seen because it's masked by the QRS complex. The ventricular repolarization is seen as the T wave on the ECG. This represents the beginning of ventricular relaxation, and the ventricles begin to relax. Therefore, the pressure drops. Quite suddenly, the pressure in the ventricle becomes less than the pressure in the conducting arteries, which causes the semilunar valves to snap close. Second heart sound, dup. Very large pinging sound, lup, dup. Two events occur during this period of time. The first of the events is that the aorta, which had just received a stroke volume amount of blood, became expanded because of the elastic fibers in the aorta. Now those elastic fibers begin to pull the aorta back in, called aortic rebound. This smooths the blood making its way into the systemic circulation, and it also allows for backwards flow of blood into the left and right coronary arteries to perfuse the heart itself. And then, on the ventricular side, the pressure in the ventricle is now less than the conducting arteries and still yet greater than the atria, so we're now, all the valves are once again all closed, and we're in a period known as isovolumetric relaxation. The amount of blood here in the ventricle at this point is referred to as the end systolic volume. The ventricular pressure drops and drops and drops because the ventricles are relaxing until the ventricular pressure relaxes so much that the ventricular pressure becomes less than the atrial pressure. Therefore, the atrioventricular valves open, and blood then begins to move once again from the atria into the ventricles to commence ventricular filling. Meanwhile, back at the SA node, those IF channels have been depolarizing to reach threshold of voltage-gated calcium channels to initiate an action potential and thus return the sinus rhythm to the heart. I hope that will help. Talk to you soon. Missing you guys on Tuesday nights. Take care.